Welcome. For folks who don't know me, I'm Will Martinez, Vice Chair of Opportunity and Health Equity for our department, and it is truly an honor to be here today to introduce our speakers for this year's Evelyn Lee Lecture. This annual lecture is held in memory of Dr. Evelyn Lee, who served as a clinical faculty member at UCSF for over 20 years, leaving behind an extraordinary legacy of advocacy for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field of mental health. Since her passing in 2003, this lectureship has carried forward her mission by inviting prominent experts to share their insights and experiences with campus trainees, faculty, and staff. Today's lecture is particularly special as we focus on the topic of disability access and inclusion. For those of you who attended yesterday's town hall, you may recall that one of my strategic goals as vice chair is to increase awareness and action around disability access and inclusion within our department. This lecture serves as the launchpad for these efforts, setting the tone for a series of events and initiatives that will take place throughout the year and beyond. And what better time to begin this important work than during National Disability Awareness Month. This month, designated by Congress, reminds us to reflect on the contributions of individuals with disabilities while addressing the barriers they continue to face in education, employment, healthcare, and beyond. Today's speakers bring deep expertise in this area, and I'm confident their insights will spark important conversations and help us challenge the status quo. Thank you all for being here and for your shared commitment to advancing disability access and inclusion. I look forward to the discussions ahead and to the work we'll accomplish together in the months to come. So without further ado, I want to introduce our three speakers for today. So first is Isabel Alvarado. She, her, ella pronouns, is the Systemwide Title IX Deputy Director at the UC Office of Civil Rights for the UC Office of the President, or UCOP. She joined UCOP after serving as the inaugural Associate Vice Chancellor of Equity and Equal Protection at UC Santa Cruz, where she held the plenary titles of Title IX Coordinator, Locally Designated Official, ADA Coordinator, and Equal Employment Opportunity Director. Isabel is the daughter of Mexican immigrants and the first in her family to attend university. She received her law degree from Monterey College of Law and completed her BA in politics at UC Santa Cruz. Isabel is a queer educational rights advocate with over 15 years of experience working on compliance in higher education and identifies as a member of the disability community. Our second speaker, Wendy Tobias, she, her pronouns, is the inaugural System-wide Disability Rights Director in the System-wide Office of Civil Rights at UCOP. Wendy joined UCOP following her role as Chief Accessibility and Inclusion Officer and ADA 504 Coordinator at UCSF, a role as Director of the Disability Programs and Resource Center at SF State, and over 11 years as a Senior Vocational Rehabilitation Counselor in the California Department of Rehabilitation. Dr. Tobias holds a doctorate degree in educational leadership, an MS in rehabilitation counseling, and a BA in psychology, all from SF State. She's a licensed professional clinical counselor and certified rehabilitation counselor. She identifies as a queer person with low vision, with interests including disability identity formations, effects on belonging, and persistence in college students in all aspects of accessibility using an intersectional lens. And last but not least is Cecile Puretz. She, her pronouns, who joined UCSF in 2022 and currently serves as the Assistant Director of the Office of Disability Access and Inclusion, an inaugural position in the Office of Opportunity and Outreach. In this role, she oversees the Disability Resource Center, a welcoming hub for all UCSF students, staff, and faculty to explore and celebrate disability identity and culture. Cecile collaborates closely with campus partners to develop educational programs and events that uplift diverse perspectives on disability and foster a strong sense of belonging across the UCSF community. Previously, Cecile founded access and community engagement programs at the Contemporary Jewish Museum and has consulted for agencies including San Francisco's Department of Disability and Aging Services and the Mayor's Office on Disability. She holds a BA in Community Studies from UC Santa Cruz and an MA in Education from Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Cecile identifies as a queer woman with mental health disabilities. With that, I'd like to give a warm round of applause for our speakers.
Good afternoon, friends. Thank you so much for inviting all of us to be here with you in community. I wanted to start by just reiterating my name, Isabel, she, her, ella pronouns. And for those of you who are joining virtually or may not be able to see me, I'm a very tiny Mexican woman with super large glasses, just barely on the right side of ridiculous, long, dark, curly hair. And I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. I want to acknowledge everybody's choice to be here. None of you had to be here. You all chose to come today and be in learning community here and remind us that this is a learning space. We all may be at different places in our own learning journey and with this topic. And so I invite you to have grace for yourself and others and be courageous in your participation here today. Today we are going to be covering a few of the things we hope you take away here is to define for you what disability is through kind of a legal lens, a social lens, but also a cultural lens. To contextualize disability through kind of an intersectional framework and invite you to sort of think about overlapping identities, define disability types and common barriers to access, and then review accommodations, examples of those things, and the interactive process. Talk a little bit about disability as identity and bias, and then practically together develop strategies for fostering meaningful participation and inclusion, which we hope become shared language for you as you endeavor as a unit on this project of increasing access in your practice and in your units. Next slide, please. Okay, so how come? Why? Why are we here? Why are we talking about this? And it's the law. We have to, right? It's here's a couple of the most commonly relevant laws, federal laws relating to accessibility. There are also equivalent California state laws, but there's also regulatory requirements as well as policy requirements. So we're talking about it because it's something we have to do, right? Next slide, please. But not just that. The reason we have to do it is because we have an obligation not to discriminate. And that means that our programs and services must be made accessible to all persons. And that means that everybody needs to be able to do the thing, right? Like we all can show up and do the thing, whatever that might be. And then I really want to invite you to think about the way that that applies in virtual spaces, especially post-COVID. The interwebs has become a place where we do things, we access things, and bring your attention to the requirement that all communications with people with disabilities, you'll see the abbreviation PWD, must be as effective as communications with others. So if you could register for this event at 2 a.m., because that's when it was convenient for you, all people must be able to have access to that level of convenience, not just the capacity to register at some point electronically. And we kind of have two strategies for meeting this charge. One is accommodations, which we'll talk about, and the other is through design, right? Universal design, or I like the word inclusive design, because universal implies we can know all things for all persons everywhere, and I am not omniscient and do not hold anybody else to that standard. But I like focusing on design because that implicates agency, right? So it's about the choices we make in the things we have control over, right? Next slide, please. And besides having to do it, it's also the right thing to do, right? Making an assumption based on your choice to be present here today. It seems like doing this is consistent with your values as an institution, as a person, whatever your commitment may be to access. The other thing is that access is a value that benefits everyone. So whether you agree or not, you're going to benefit. We when we design for disability inclusion, we all benefit, and we'll have some examples of that kind of innovation and shared community benefit from this lens as we go on. And then also it's really important to acknowledge that human variation, the human experience, it includes disability. And that variation drives innovation and excellence. And then lastly, justice is disability justice, right? That an aspect of justice is inclusive of disability justice, and we are all connected, right? So through a community lens, it matters. It's the right thing to do. I'm going to hand it over to Wendy for the next portion of our section.
Thanks, Isabel. I need to adjust the microphone a little taller. I'm the big, tall one. Again, Wendy Tobias, she, her pronouns. And so I'm going to talk to you for a moment about statistics, and then I'm going to talk to you about disability law, which I totally know is the way to hook an audience. But that's going to be our foundation. And I'm going to run along fairly quickly with ideas because we only have so much time in this presentation. And we definitely want to make sure all of our colleagues here have our time to present, and we have some time hopefully for questions at the end. So bear with me, but there will be slides available, I believe, to you after the presentation. So first of all, a little bit, well, actually two things. One is just, again, I'm a person with low vision. I'm going to try to give you eye contact, but in order to see my notes, you know. Okay, so first of all, you may know, according to the CDC, that 1 in 4 people have disabilities. It's actually about 28% last I checked. So we know that this large number is worthy of consideration when we're thinking of implementing universal access beyond accommodations. This is a huge population. It's the largest intersectional group that any one of us can join at any time. Of course, we know people with disabilities can be any age, gender, ethnicity, race, religion, part of the LGBTQI community, be our students, our faculty, staff, patients, visitors, and anyone else we can name, right? And I think the biggest takeaway here is that whether we know it or not, whether we think we know it or not, always assume people with disabilities are in the room, whatever room you're in, whether it's physical, hybrid, or remote, right? So next slide, Cecile, thank you. I'm gonna start with this fun legal section here. What do we define as a disability when we're thinking about it in a legal context? And I'm not going to give you all the various definitions because there are many, but I'm going to use highlighted ones that I think will work for the purposes of this presentation. So first and foremost, a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Examples of major life activities could be anything from breathing, walking, talking, hearing, seeing, sleeping, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, working. Major life activities also include major bodily functions such as immune system functions, normal cell growth, otherwise perhaps known as cancer, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. Now, we have to also check in with ourselves for the state definition of disability in certain contexts. So, for example, in California, when we are talking about employment, any employee, whether you're like a full-time professional employee or a student employee, for employment and housing, maybe you live, for example, in on-campus housing, the definition changes ever so slightly. It is a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity. So the standard for determining an eligible disability is lower when we're in California and we're talking about employment and housing. And we're not going to go too far in depth into that, but I wanted to call that out for you. So the first prong I just talked to you about, you have a disability that limits or substantially limits one or more major life activities. Then we have a record of physical or mental impairment. And that usually is some kind of maybe documentation of the disability, use of accommodations, so, whatever that documentation may or may not look like, maybe it's medical, maybe it could be something else. I will also call out in California, remember that I'm going to keep talking about employment and housing. In California, for employment and housing, we cannot ask for a diagnosis of disability, only what we call functional limitations. So a functional limitation is, let's say I do have a back problem, and my limitation is that I cannot lift more than 10 pounds, or I need instructions in writing in addition to verbally, something like that. So in many cases, but not all cases, we cannot ask for the diagnosis if somebody needs an accommodation. Okay, so we have two prongs. You have a disability or you have a record of a disability. Third prong, being regarded as somebody who has a disability or an impairment. And that might look like somebody treating a person as if they have a disability when they don't. That's one example. So regarded as, this third prong I'm talking about relates to discrimination only, discrimination and bias. You're not going to be provided, unfortunately, a reasonable accommodation if you do not in fact have a disability. So next slide, please. So disability, of course, can be permanent, like a spinal cord injury, temporary, maybe a broken bone that requires physical therapy, chronic or episodic, like migraines. Apparent, for example, somebody that you can see uses sign language, or non-apparent, maybe somebody that has depression or anxiety or another mental health disability. And then lastly, some disabilities are sort of situational. And these may not be what we normally think of disabilities, but they may be something that's more temporary, maybe not being able to use for 10 minutes one of your arms because you're holding a baby in it, that kind of thing. Or maybe not being able to hear very well in a crowded room when you otherwise don't have any issues. And this room is very, very, very loud, and almost all the people have a problem hearing, kind of thing. So again, in this situation, there is maybe a disability, if you will, but that's also not going to be something where there would be an accommodation. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about accommodations. What are these things? What do we mean? How are we going to get them? More legal definitions. Yay. Okay. So a public entity, and I'll read this to you, public entity shall make reasonable modifications in policies, practices, or procedures when modifications are necessary to avoid discrimination on the basis of disability, unless the public entity, aka in this case, the UC, can demonstrate that making the modifications would fundamentally alter the nature of the service, program, or activity. This particular definition applies to situations for student accommodations, patients, guests, and there's as I mentioned, there are some different definitions for folks that might fall under employment or housing. Next slide. So what do accommodations include? They need to be reasonable. Reasonable modifications and accommodations can apply to students, employees, patients, and visitors under various laws, as I mentioned. For example, for our employees, this can include our full-time, our part-time employees. At UCSF in particular, employees includes our residents, postdocs, and fellows, and our student employees. And if you're wondering what law relates to those folks, that's Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Employment and Housing Act here in California, as well as the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504. Everyone else, students, patients, guests, generally we're talking about Title II of the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehab Act, just in case you're like, I want to know what goes with what. And there are more, but those are the main ones. Okay, so the next tenet here is that accommodations are determined on an individual case-by-case basis. Individual case-by-case. We cannot generalize because Cecile has one accommodation and I happen to know I have the same disability that I'm going to get the same accommodation. Maybe Cecile has a different job than I do, things of that nature. Also, accommodations may be supported by appropriate medical documentation or direct observation of the disability. Certainly in our case at the UC, the university has the right to ask for documentation. However, requests should be limited in scope, made only by an appropriate office who manages accommodations, and I'll talk about those offices in a little bit, and requested only when necessary to determine the scope of the disability's functional limitations, remember those that I talked about, and how the functional limitations have a nexus to the accommodation request. Also, accommodations do not compromise academic standards or fundamentally alter a program or service. We're not going to go deep into this today again, but I wanted to talk a little bit about it. The determination that an accommodation may compromise academic, employment, medical care, or other programs and services by undermining core objectives or content, so undermining core objectives or content, that's a fundamental alteration, should be made in consultation with the office who manages accommodations. And so, for example, for our students, that's student disability services. For any employee, that's disability management services. There is support if you happen to be involved in accommodations processes, whether you're the person who's asking for the accommodation or working with that person. You are not alone. If there's a fundamental alteration for some reason, other accommodations that would not cause the fundamental alteration need to be discussed as possibilities and considered. Next slide. What makes an accommodation reasonable? The accommodation needs to be effective. It allows an otherwise qualified person with a disability to perform the essential functions of whatever it is you're doing or requirements. For example, being a student, what are the requirements in your program? Being an employee, what are those requirements, et cetera? It addresses the individual needs of the person with a disability, as we discussed, and it allows the person with a disability to have meaningful access and participation. This is according to our laws. They wrote meaningful access into the law, not just that we're going to accommodate you, but they said, no, this means that the individual's accommodation must ensure that they have full and actual inclusion in the program or service. What does that mean? For an employee, here's an example. A best practice would be to provide an ASL interpreter for, of course, things like supervision and staff meetings and the like, but also professional development, networking, promotional opportunities, access to any benefit of employment, like being able to attend with access a party for all employees that everyone else is invited to, or for students, for example, a graduation. Also, accommodations need to be appropriate. They don't fundamentally alter essential requirements. They don't pose something called an undue burden or hardship for the organization or institution. So here's another asterisk. I put that asterisk there on purpose to remind us that the terms undue administrative or financial burden, or for employment, undue hardship, interchangeable terms, okay? These are sometimes reasons why the accommodation as requested may not be provided. So these reasons kind of go beyond just mere, I need to do extra work. This is a little, maybe a person even thinks it's annoying to have to do extra work. Hopefully not, because we're all human, we all help each other, right? But so it goes beyond minor inconvenience, and it goes beyond generally the cost to any one department most of the time. The financial analysis can go beyond that department level. So this is something to be discussed with folks if you sort of think this is a direction you're going with an accommodation where you're thinking undue administrative hardship or financial burden. Let's see here. And if you do think that if you're going in that direction, this is the time to pause, stop and contact one of the offices you're working with regarding accommodations. Get some consultation. Again, you are not alone, but do so before you maybe say, no, we're not going to move forward with this accommodation. Okay, next slide. So some of this is a little bit of a review, but what accommodations are. Modifications to the environment or program to provide equal and meaningful access, they are remedial. They're mitigating some kind of lack of access in the physical or programmatic environment, and they generally require some kind of disclosure by the person with a disability, or maybe a third party Sometimes this might happen. You think, why would a third party? Well, maybe the patient is a minor and then the parent is asking for an accommodation on behalf of their child. And of course, accommodations, as Isabel already noted, might be able to benefit all people. For example, a good and often kind of utilized but not spoken of kind of common benefit is using captions in presentations can also benefit individuals who might be emergent bilingual English learners. Next slide. So just a couple examples of accommodations in school, clerkship, or work. This list is not exhaustive. Okay, so these are just some highlights of accommodations. Extended time, distraction reviews, and distraction reduced environment. These items can assist with emotional or cognitive disabilities and some of the effects caused by these physical disabilities or chronic illness. So let's say you have some depression related to a chronic illness, something like that. Note takers, certainly in addition to the above, people who are hard of hearing or deaf or have motor skills disabilities, are low vision or blind, might benefit from notes, which by the way are a lot different. Taking notes is different than having a transcript, a full transcript of everything that was said in order of a presentation or a lecture. Text in alternate format or audiobooks. This might benefit people with vision, learning, or cognitive disabilities, including ADHD, autism, traumatic brain injury, and the like. Sign language interpreting and real-time captioning. Most frequently, these are used for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, but might be also useful for things like folks who have auditory processing disorder, as this is more thought to be a neurological and is sort of a lesser known disability. Adaptive equipment or software. Individuals who use a screen reader because they're blind and can't see the screen, so that everything has to be spoken to them. Screen magnification, which is something I use. Proofreading software, organizational software, folks who can't use a standard mouse or keyboard, or folks who use an augmentative and alternative communication device, which is a board that they can gaze at or touch, and it will sort of speak what they are not able to easily speak. And then also eye gaze devices. Also in alternative workstation modifications or modified schedules. So people who might need a sit-stand desk, a specific work chair. Here at UCSF, we have, maybe you know about the WOW stations, the workstation on wheels, maybe modifying that in clinical situations, lighting or sound adjustments in the environment, specific outline breaks to rest from physical or cognitive load, or to maybe attend medical appointments. Next slide. So those are some examples, but let's move into how do we get some of these accommodations that we're hoping for if we're a person with a disability or we're working with one. So there's something called the interactive process. And basically, what does this mean? It's just a discussion. It's a back and forth. And it's where the individual with a disability and the university, in our case, or the organization, discusses the accommodation request, and the university, in our case, provides an outcome. The discussion should be detailed enough to make sure that all parties who need to be involved are involved. And it's not something, for instance, where maybe the person with a disability sends an email and then the organization just says, no, we're not going to do it, but there's no discussion about it or back and forth. Let's talk about this. What are some options and so forth? So the interactive process includes the notification of disability. So there's some different categories here just to be aware of. Disability status, diagnosis. Again, don't ask for diagnosis in what? Employment and housing situations. But to be honest with you, those functional limitations, if you're a person seeking accommodations or working with someone who is, knowing the diagnosis is much less important than what those functional limitations are, right? When we're really thinking about how to help somebody have access. Then causality. There needs to be an adjustment or aid because of a disability in order to have a reasonable accommodation. And of course, reasonableness. There needs to be a rational review of the program and requirements. And we need to determine whether the proposed accommodation allows the otherwise qualified person with a disability to perform those essential requirements. and whether proposed accommodations would result in a waiver or lowering of essential requirements or otherwise fundamentally alter the nature of the program. Finally, and this is a missed bullet on the slide, so I just want to call your attention to the other bullet would be, is there an undue burden or hardship in the situation? And then, next slide. Disclosing disability. What are ways that a disclosure might happen? So first and foremost, in general, the person with a disability decides how they disclose and when, or if even. So that might be, I have a disability. That might be it. That might start it. Or they might say, I have a chronic illness or back issues, something like that. Or a medical diagnosis. Again, people might refer to their particular disability in that way. I have asthma, I have Lyme disease, etc. Function limitations. I might say, again, I can't lift more than 10 pounds. I need breaks every 10 minutes. I need a lower distraction environment, etc. And then there's the other piece of it, which is sometimes there's an apparent disability, and that obviously changes the disclosure situation for the person. Sometimes you don't always have a choice. When I'm walking around with my guide cane, you kind of know what's going on with me. Could be a person with a wheelchair, mobility device, guide dog, and so on. Another point where a person may not have as much autonomy and disclosure is if they have sustained a workers' compensation injury, and then people kind of might know about that because there's paperwork involved and so on. So here's almost one of the biggest points I can say today. When somebody discloses, keep that information confidential. This is somebody's personal information, some level of their medical information, and whether or not that person has a process going for accommodations or they have them, the only people that need to know are people that need to know. That means, for example, if there's an approved accommodation, then only the people that need to help with actually implementing that accommodation only need to know the most limited information about what that is. All right. So I'm just checking time because I know we need to move forward quickly here. I am going to skip a few things. But I just wanted to mention the last point was that many people with disabilities may not feel comfortable sharing their disability. Why? Most prevalently, stigma. Unfortunately, it's very common still in our society. We have, our students in our programs, faculty. These are populations here at UCSF where it's particularly prevalent that folks are concerned about disclosure. Because they fear some kind of negative repercussion. And we need to do more and more, like have these types of discussions to change that culture. And then finally, I just wanted to call out in the next and final slide that I have today is additional accommodation resources that I mentioned to you before. So I wanted to make sure you know here at UCSF, if you are working with patients in our UCSF health system, if you need assistance as a clinical team member, you can go to the patient relations office for that assistance, looking at the accommodation request. For employees with disabilities, again, that office is Disability Management Services. And for students, that office is Student Disability Services. So thank you so much. And I'd like to toss it to Cecile for the next session.
Thank you, Wendy. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Cecile Puretz. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Assistant Director of Disability Access and Inclusion. And now that Isabel and Wendy have laid the groundwork around the legal framework around disability, I really want to take us through some of the historical groundwork that disabled people fought so hard for us to have these laws today. And I do want to emphasize that we are still actively fighting for that recognition and those laws today. So in this next section, we're going to explore some of those pivotal turning points in the disability rights movement, We'll also touch on some of the common stereotypes and biases that continue to pose barriers for disabled people. And then lastly, we'll define ableism and some of the common ways that it manifests in our attitudes, in our language, in our built environment. So here on the first slide, we see an image from one of the first disability marches, Disability Pride March, introducing this idea that the disability rights movement introduced the idea of disability as a social construct based on existing barriers. So you may have heard historically, the medical model of disability has historically framed disabled people as in need of help, in need of curing and fixing, lacking their own agency. And so the disability rights movement challenged this view that disability is actually a positive part of our identity and pride, and that disabled people don't want to be fixed, that they're experts of their own lived experience. Next slide. So I'm going to very briefly present some of those key milestones in the disability rights movement. It's a long and complicated history that continues today. As early as the 1800s, we saw the founding of the first formal education for the deaf and deafblind communities, as well as the invention of Braille. And starting in the early 20th century was a set of discriminatory laws and practices called the ugly laws. Dr. Susan Schweik at UC Berkeley writes extensively about these laws that basically criminalized folks with disabilities, particularly people with physical disabilities who were considered unsightly or ugly, making it illegal for people to be in public. In the 1940s, we saw that perspective started to change with World War II. Veterans were returning from home with disabilities, and this played a role in shifting public attitudes. Many fought for better access to rehabilitation, healthcare, and employment, pushing for the government to make changes. The 1950s and 60s, we saw the advancement of the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 built a lot of the foundations for our US disability rights, but disability was still not considered a protected category. And then that leads us into the 1970s, where we saw some of the most significant advances in some of the first disability rights laws. 1972 was the birth of the independent living movement right here in the Bay Area, Ed Roberts in Berkeley. I also want to name in 1975, the East Oakland Center for Independent Living that particularly served the African American community, Bradley Lomax. In 1973, we saw the first law, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And in 1977, we'll talk about that in the next slide, a landmark Section 504 sit-in. The 80s, adapt activism. We saw the Capitol crawl, fighting for access to public transportation and access to federal buildings. Of course, we may be all familiar with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 1990s. The disability justice movement, which I'll talk about a little bit later, was coined in 2005. And then again in 2008, there was an expansion of the definition of disabilities with the Americans with Disabilities Amendment Act. Next slide. So again, that was a very quick. So I do want to highlight the title of this slide, Nothing About Us Without Us. This is a really cornerstone motto of the disability rights movement that basically says that no policy, no program, no building should be designed without the full and direct participation of the people who are most impacted by that policy. And so again, just through some images here, I want to highlight Section 504 sit-in 1977. We're actually our Disability Resource Center will be hosting an exhibition in the Parnassus Library that touches on this moment. It was the longest running peaceful occupation of a federal building here in San Francisco that resulted in the signing of Section 504. And then I don't have all the time, but to go through the Capitol crawl, adapt activism, and the signing of the ADA, I highly encourage you all to learn about these moments. Next slide, please. So disability justice, as I mentioned, was a political framework that was coined in 2005 by a number of primarily disabled queer activists here in Oakland. We recently lost Patty Byrne, who was one of the founders. And so disability justice was a departure from disability rights movement, which in many ways they argued did not serve those who were multiply marginalized. So disabled people of color, disabled poor people. And so they also have 10 principles of disability justice highlighted in this book called Skin, Tooth, and Bone. The basis of our movement is our people. Next slide. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the commonly held stereotypes and biases. Here are two definitions of stereotype and bias. Disability biases do stem from ableism, which we'll define in a moment. And in a nutshell, it's the belief that typical abilities are superior. So next slide. So here are some common disability biases that tend to view disabled people as inherently inferior to non-disabled people, and they tend to be rooted in the medical model. So some negative biases are that disabled people are tragic or pitiful or scary when you think about some of the characters you see in films or popular culture, or they're angry, the angry disabled person trope, or worthless, incapable, lacking agency, lazy, undeserving. These are very harmful biases. And then there's also the flip side, where we have what's called, in air quotes, inspiration porn, where disabled people are celebrated for their achievements because of their disability, when in fact they're just crossing the street, right? Or that disabled people are deserving of preferential treatment or special attention. Next slide. Now, language, as allies, language is so important. The way we talk about people with disabilities, the way we communicate in our marketing. There's no one way, no one consensus. Everyone has their own preference. So I do want to honor that with language. So you may have heard of person first language, a person with a disability or a person who has anxiety. Also, there are some folks, particularly disabled activists, who prefer to use identity first language. I identify as a disabled person. I'm autistic or a deaf person. And I think the key point here is that language evolves. Like pronouns, it's not something that's fixed. We grow. And so to always check in with people on their preference. Disability is also for some people a real part of their identity and their pride. It's important to avoid jargon, stigmatizing language. You may have heard differently able, special needs, handicapped. Oftentimes these are euphemisms that are meant to skirt around disability as if it's something like a bad word, right? And so we're coming up with a lot of different language that actually doesn't name disability. And disability is not a bad word. And then again, avoiding negative language. Someone suffers or a victim of or confined to a wheelchair. Often wheelchairs are liberating for people. Next slide. And then just a couple more euphemisms. Sometimes I see disability, emphasizing the ability, special needs, differently abled, the deaf, the blind, the blind, the deaf, right? So like generalizing people into this larger category. Physically challenged, handicapable. I really don't get these. Disability experience. Also, I think checking our own language. I think also we'll talk about saneism in just a moment, but often we use words, oh, that's so crazy, or that's insane, that's psychotic, right? Or a freak. These are words that are inherently ableism. Okay, next slide. And so I also want to leave you with a definition of what is ableism. We've been talking about some of the language. This is Talila T.L. Lewis, who is a disability justice activist and abolitionist, and comes up with this definition: a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So I really want us to kind of let that last sentence. We could do an entire lecture on this. Next slide. Here are just a couple of ways that ableism manifests. Lack of compliance with disability rights laws, segregating adults and children with disabilities into different classrooms or schools, failing to incorporate accessibility into our building design. Inaccessible websites, this is particularly important. Wendy talked to us about sort of this digital world that we also have to think about, using disability as a joke or a punchline. And again, we talked about framing disability as tragic or inspirational or needing to be fixed. Next slide. And so we also, just because of the department that we're presenting as, also wanted to briefly touch on saneism. We maybe have heard about ableism, but saneism is the prejudice specifically against people with mental illness, mental health disabilities, or cognitive differences. And it stems from this idea that there is a normal mind, or a mind that is more productive, more desirable. There is a long history of violence in psychiatric care facilities. In fact, I encourage you all to read Dr. Sami Schock, who presented at a Grand Rounds here a number of years ago, who wrote Black Disability Politics. Folks with mental health disabilities are often criminalized, and there are many negative stereotypes and tropes. Okay. And then last but not least, we'll touch a little bit on disability and intersectionality, but ultimately the idea is that people with disabilities often have multiple intersecting identities. We all do, but we do know that folks with disabilities who are also multiply marginalized by race, racism, homophobia, poverty, or are system impacted, have poorer health outcomes. And so we have to understand that there is a complexity of identities, especially as we're thinking about healthcare. There's also the compounding effects of these systems of oppression and how they amplify each other. And then lastly, our identities cannot be separated. So it's a very brief, I can't do justice to intersectionality here, but hopefully this gave you a nice overview of some of the cultural and identity framework. Thank you.
Hi, friends. So we are ideally at the time where we would be talking to each other and hearing from you and questions that we have, but we still have a few slides to cover on inclusion. I wanted to tie into Cecile's last point, was wholeness. And so I really want to make sure that I say this out loud, that perhaps one of the most valuable things as a person with a disability and doing compliance is that disability offers us the presumption that everybody is whole already, that everybody is an expert on their own experience, and that dignity is a standard, and the standard with which we should engage each other. Right. So I really wanted to say that out loud as we talk about some practical strategies for inclusion in our programs that I will try to race through, keeping in mind that conversation should be prioritized over a presentation. Okay. So I mentioned it briefly, but universal design is an architectural principle, 7 really, that help us to anticipate error, need, and design, take responsibility for designing for everyone, not just like the standard mean, right? Okay, so here are those 7 principles. I'm going to rely on the fact that you can access these materials afterwards. And so what is kind of the importance of inclusive design as opposed to standard? The standard is aimed at like the normal person, while inclusive design is aimed at everybody. And really importantly, it invites the designers, the people who make decisions, to take responsibility for those choices and that design, right? So it's kind of empowering. If you are designing from an inclusive design perspective, you are really looking at like, what can I choose and how will that impact the way folks access, participate, and engage with me? And it could be as little as the way you arrange the furniture in your office, the literature that's available for folks, and as large as having a whole conversation about inclusive strategies for an event like this. Yeah. The social model of inclusion really embraces that it's those choices as a society and as a designer that create the barriers for access and participation rather than the actual diagnosis or impairment in the person, right? It's through no deficit or fault or moral failing that there is lack of access, but rather it's a failure of design. It's a practical problem. We can talk about it. Typically, I'm of the opinion that you should not need a guide for how to talk to another person. But I did want to make sure that we included some slides on kind of some standard etiquette, some things that to help you be a more engaging, kind, and thoughtful community member. So there's a few slides here on general disability etiquette. And I really want to, again, highlight assume wholeness, assume competence. People can tell you what they need. And if support with having that conversation is an accommodation, then you're not alone. There are experts on this campus to help you facilitate that conversation. But start from assuming wholeness, assuming agency, and assuming competence and with everybody that you interact with. Okay. Develop a plan. Assume at some point someone is going to ask you for accommodations. So have a designated point of contact. Have a statement so that nothing says you are welcome here like anything that signals that you planned for me to be here and that you anticipated I might need something for you to benefit from my full participation. And again, in the interest of prioritizing conversation, I'm going to zoom past all these slides and read the title. So there's some strategies for inclusive design in physical spaces. I want to highlight that frontline staff, especially because that is the first impression somebody gets, should have some training about how to receive a request for accommodation, what to do with that request, and especially how to answer a phone from relay service, right? Those sound like 800 calls or like sales calls, but it's a service helping to facilitate communication to someone who may have communication barriers. And if you hang up, that sucks. It's a whole lot of effort to especially now, to even just make a phone call and then ask someone to make you make that phone call and then to get hung up on. So make sure that your frontline staff is prepared to receive those disclosures, to receive those requests, and to be on the phone with the relay service. Okay, there's ideas for inclusive design and technology for your websites and other electronic communications, some inclusive design for response readiness, and outreach communications, as well as some ideas for preparing your department to engage in the interactive process. And the really important thing I want to say about the interactive process is that it doesn't just benefit the person asking access. It invites us to think about what is fundamental in our program, in our activity. What is essential about what we are doing here and now, and the how we do it, right? Because usually accommodations come in the form of, can you change how you present it? Why does it have to be done in 6 months? And that's a conversation. So be prepared to have a thoughtful conversation about what you're doing, how you're doing, and why you are doing it. And that is already a step towards inclusion because it means you are prepared to have an interactive process conversation. Okay, and again, nothing about us without us. And a reminder that 28% is a significant portion of the population, and not to be fatalist or weird, but it could be you. And if not right now, in the future, right? This is likely going to be a part of your own experience. So lots of grace. I don't want to woo, but happy Halloween. Yeah, it's likely, right? Assume somebody with a disability is in the room always. And it might be in the hallway, and it might not be the colleague that you're talking to. It might be the student who is contemplating asking for accommodations and just got a very clear message what you think about that because they overheard your conversation, right? So nothing about us without us, and we're everywhere. Some key takeaways for you. I think you may have noticed in the introduction, all of us identify as part of the disability community. My colleagues shared their disability diagnosis or which particular part of the community. Folks, I didn't, and I did that on purpose because this is a learning environment, right? And so now we've gotten comfortable, you've heard from me a little bit, and then, I choose to say, like, you're probably looking at me and wondering, like, what's wrong with her? And like, the answer is twofold. Nothing's wrong with me. I said I had a disability. I didn't say there was something wrong with me. And second of all, I'm setting you up a little bit because none of your business. What matters, right? How many of you had to fill out a medical questionnaire before you walked in here? What matters is access and participation. Your focus should be on what do you need, right? And not because you're doing me a kindness, but because that's my right to walk in here and participate and communicate just like the rest of you. And you're welcome, right? Like, you're welcome. I'm here, you're here, we're learning from each other. So having this interactive conversation is about improving the quality of the perspective and experiences that are in the room so that we all benefit from each other's contributions. Okay, and I know I sped through a ton of that. I want to make sure that you have access to your campus resources, right? For if you have a question, before you say no, think how, and then call these folks, right? Make sure you understand what the ask is, and then have a how conversation. And then sometimes it's not just about access and participation. You will get a disclosure of experiences that may constitute harassment or discrimination, right? This is protected. There is a legal requirement. So sometimes when you are hearing a disclosure of trouble with access and prior requests, it's also a notice to provide information for how to file a complaint or otherwise get support from a civil rights office. Okay, and I think very few minutes, but some Q&A, maybe one or two. All right, thank you, friends.
This is just very practical. You brought up like UCSF Health for getting disability accommodations, but someone had asked me recently for a research participant bringing in service dogs, and I didn't even know where to go to direct the person. So I know this is not a huge question, but more practical.
That's actually a great question. So the Disability Resource Center has been working with CTSI, the Clinical and Translational. And so specifically, there are research accessibility consultations that you can on the CTSI website. And so you can reach out specifically to somebody that can give you guidance on ensuring that research participants with disabilities can fully access the clinical study. Yeah, great question.
Mike? Yeah. Hi. So you mentioned in the interactive process that there seems to be a line around disclosure and disclosure to the people who need to know. And I'm wondering if you could sort of clarify how, like, does the person asking for an accommodation not need to disclose at all to the disability officer who's writing up the accommodation plan? Like, is it never ever discussed? I mean, I know that I don't need to know, right? But how do we then sort of check that we're doing the right thing by that person if we don't have the information?
That's a great question. And so it is, the way the law is set up right now in the US is that if a person with a disability needs an accommodation, it is incumbent upon them to make a disclosure. Hey, I need some help. I'm having some trouble at work. And then Isabel might say something like, if she's my supervisor, well, how can I help you? And I'm, well, I'm having a flare up of my disability, whatever it is, right? And she might even say something like, hey, guess what? you don't need to tell me more right now. Why don't you go to the disability management services if you're an employee, or if you're a faculty member and you hear this, why don't you go to the student disability services and talk with them? And there would be a conversation, and then either those offices, or even in the health side, like patient relations, for example, would be one, talk with the individual who needs the accommodation and determine, hey, is there documentation needed to support what this request is, et cetera. And then on the flip side, let's say there's a documentation being considered on either it's academic or employment, et cetera, then they might bring in the faculty member or the supervisor or manager and only disclose what is absolutely needed for that manager to determine if, like, hey, can I facilitate that accommodation in, say, this workplace or in this classroom, that kind of thing. And then sometimes, maybe in a department, for example, there might be, let's say we needed to make sure there's captioning in every single staff meeting for a person. There might be maybe an admin person who would do that. So you may not need to say, hey, there's a person with a disability that needs that as the supervisor, but you might tell that admin person, hey, I need to let you know for every single meeting that we have, we must have captioning. And if that person says, but why? Well, this is one of those situations where we probably don't need to add more information to that. But I hope that answers your question. But if you need some more clarification, I'm happy to talk offline.
Thank you. I mean, I just wanted to add like two things, right? One is sometimes, especially in that example, like none of your business is being super professional, right? Like, so when we're having the conversation, getting really comfortable with like, oh, I play a role in this, but that doesn't mean that because I play a role in facilitation that I need to know. It's like not just that you need to know, but what you need to know to facilitate, and getting real comfortable with also like what would happen if you said yes? What instead of prove it, is your documentation in place? How do we know they really need it? We started with, what do you need? Right? Like, what if we started with, I believe you that you know what you need, what has worked for you in the past, and here's the correct resource, right? And as a courtesy, here's what I can do until you have this kind of conversation, right? But if it's a super little ask, and you're like, before we can have a discussion about accommodations, you got to go through this whole process. And all the while you like had an extra notes already printed out and it's easy and you're willing, like, right? So I would say lead with, believe people, believe that they're competent and they know what they need, and that you will all act in good faith to document as necessary and like follow procedures.
Thank you all. And I appreciate folks who are able to stay for more time. We're going to have more opportunities for this. These are great questions, but if you have anything, please send it my way, or our Sloan, Caboose, I don't see them here. They might be online. The education subcommittee is going to leave some of these follow-up trainings as well. So we will have more opportunities to learn. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.